The discovery in the ashes. The fire hadn't gone out. It lingered like sorrow, curling smoke in gray ribbons up toward a pale Wyoming sky. The wind blew dry across the base of Elk Mountain, carrying the sour tang of scorched timber and something darker, something human. Ro Vance, riding alone with the late summer dust gathering on his hat brim, caught the scent before he saw it. He'd been chasing a steer that had broken loose a dull routine made sharper by what now stained the wind. When he crested the ridge, he reined in hard. Below him, a small homestead lay in ruin. The roof had collapsed inward like a broken rib cage. The barn was nothing but blackened skeleton wood. The fence sagged in waves like it mourned the place it could no longer protect. Ro felt the tightness in his chest before his fingers even moved to the rifle slung across his saddle. This wasn't an accident. The silence confirmed it too. Still too empty, too final. He nudged his horse down the slope, heart pounding slow and heavy. Ash swirled with each hoofbeat, soft as snow, but crueler. And then he saw her. At first he thought she was a ghost, a figure crawling through the gray soot dress, torn the fabric stained with sweat and blood and smoke. Her feet were bare, dragging behind her skin cut and blistered. Her arms moved like they weren't her own, scraping the ground, searching for something invisible. Ro swung out of the saddle without thinking. "Miss, stop moving. You're hurt," he called, voice firm but careful. She didn't lift her head. Her hands were pressed to the earth as if she could keep the house from falling deeper into memory. Her shoulders shook, not from cold, but something worse. Grief still alive inside her body. He knelt beside her. "Are you alone?" he asked. Her voice came back cracked and nearly soundless. "My children." That single word changed everything. The plea and the promise. Ro's breath caught in his throat. Her voice barely touched the air, yet it struck like thunder. She turned, then just enough for him to see her face, and he wished she hadn't. Bruises bloomed along her jawline, her lip was split and swollen, and a fresh burn traced the edge of her collarbone. Smoke still clung to her hair. She didn't look at him like a stranger. She looked at him like the last person the world might spare. "They took them," she rasped. "They took my babies." Her arms gave out and she collapsed against the ash-laden earth. Ro lunged, catching her before she hit the ground, his arms curling instinctively around her weightless form. She shook like dry grass in windlight, as a bundle of kindling too easy to carry for someone who just lost everything. He gathered her close, lifting her up onto the saddle in front of him. "Tell me your name," he said as he swung back up. She blinked, slow, the whites of her eyes rimmed in red. "Cella," she whispered. "Cella Monroe. My children, Reed and Ruthie. 8 twins." Ro tightened his grip around her. "I'll find them," he vowed. "But first we get you safe." She didn't hear him. Her body went limp as they rode. By the time they reached his cabin, a solitary one-room shelter tucked 3 miles up a mountain hollow, she had passed out. He dismounted and carried her inside, like something sacred heart, heavy with the weight of her words and the promise now burning in his chest. Shelter in the pines. The cabin wasn't meant for guests. Ro had built it after the war, after the cattle drives, after the woman he once loved, married a man who hadn't come back broken. He'd laid every beam with a kind of silence that doesn't need company. There was a cot, a stove, and shelves of things he rarely touched. It wasn't much, but it was clean, safe, and far enough from anyone to forget how loud the world could be. He laid Cella gently on the cot, brushing soot from her cheek with a cloth soaked in cold water. Her skin was hot to the touch, fever rising. He fed her broth by the spoonful when she stirred, changed the bandages he wrapped around her arm, and wiped sweat from her brow while she mumbled in sleep. The children's names were always on her lips. When she finally woke, the pain in her eyes steadied her voice. Ro sat near the stove, not pressing, just listening. 3 men, she said hoarsely. They came after dark. Said they needed water. I told them no. They came anyway. Knocked me down. Burned it all, took Reed and Ruthie. Said they'd fetch a price out east. Her lips trembled, but her eyes didn't look away. Ro clenched his jaw, the fire in his chest turning sharp. Traffickers, he muttered. She nodded, eyes brimming but resolute. I tried to stop them. He believed her. You're safe now, he said, rising to his feet. I can track them. But her hand shot out and gripped his wrist. What if they hurt them? She choked. They won't, Ro said, voice low and full. I won't let them. He left before dawn, the rifle strapped across his back, the weight of her pain and his own vow wrapped around his shoulders like armor. Trail of ash and memory. The mountain held its silence as Ro descended before sunrise, shadows still folded beneath the aspens. The world was silver with morning haze, but his mind was sharp with purpose. He'd hunted men before, once in uniform, once for cattle thieves, but never like this. This wasn't justice, and it wasn't revenge. It was something else entirely. A vow lit like gunpowder in his ribs. A promise made to a woman who barely had strength left to speak. The trail was cold at first. Whoever took the children knew how to move without leaving much behind. But Ro had ridden long enough in this land to know its signs. A patch of disturbed grass, a broken twig where there shouldn't be one, ash kicked up where a boot had scuffed. He followed these like whispers, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. By noon, he found where they had crossed a creek, likely thinking the water would hide their tracks. But Ro knew better. The bank held impressions, a heavier print from a man dragging something smaller, prints too fading fast, but still there. Reed and Ruthie. They were close. That night he camped under a low ridge, fireless, back against a stone. He didn't sleep. Every creak of the trees or rustle of brush snapped his eyes open. In the morning he found the place they had camped. Coals still warm, and in the dirt near the ashes of their fire, childish scrawls. A heart and 2 initials, RR plus R. Ro knelt by the drawing, his chest tightening. The twins were alive. Still together. Still trying to hold on. He pressed his palm to the dirt as if the image could speak to him. Then he rose sharper than before. His horse was already weary, but he urged it forward with a steady hand. There was no rest until this was done. Blood and dust in the canyon. By the second evening, Ro's horse was foaming at the mouth, breath hard as bellows, but they reached the canyon nonetheless. The rocks opened like a wound in the land, deep and slope-fringed by twisted pines and thorned scrub. He tethered the gelding beneath cover, climbed down by foot, and crawled toward the ridge of an outcropping. Below a campfire burned too bright for men who weren't afraid. 3 of them exactly as Cella had said. One laughed with his back to the flame, another cleaned his teeth with a knife, and near the wagon wheel 2 small figures huddled tight wrist to wrist, eyes wide and faces smudged with fear. Ro's pulse slowed. He didn't shake. He waited until the moon cast just enough light for a clean shot. 1 bullet. The first man crumpled without a sound. The second turned fumbling for his pistol. Ro moved down fast, knife in hand. He caught the man before the shot fired steel sinking into the soft ribs beneath his arm. The third man bolted. Ro let him go. The children hadn't screamed. They were frozen. Ro moved slow palms out. "Reed. Ruthie. I'm Ro. Your mama sent me." Ruthie blinked once, then burst into tears. Reed didn't cry. He just launched himself forward and wrapped his arms around Ro's neck like he'd known him his whole life. They rode back by starlight. The reunion Ro's cabin came into view at the edge of dawn, its chimney curling smoke like a beacon through the trees. 3 days had passed since he rode out. 3 days of ash gunpowder, dirt and dust. But now there was breath in his lungs again, and a weight behind him, 2 small, warm bodies holding on heads nestled into his coat. Cella stood on the porch before he could even call out. Her hair was braided back, her dress clean but threadbare. The bruises on her face had begun to fade, but the shadows in her eyes had not. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and then she saw them. "Ruthie," she gasped. The girl leapt from the saddle, running barefoot across the grass. Mama Reed cried out next, tumbling after his sister. They collided in the yard, arms wrapped so tight they shook. Cella dropped to her knees in the grass, clinging to both of them, rocking back and forth in silent sobs. Ro dismounted without a word and stepped back. It felt too sacred to witness, but then Cella looked up. Her mouth quivered. "You brought them back." Ro met her gaze. "I gave you my word." She rose slowly, legs unsteady but determined, and crossed the space between them. There was ash still caught in her hair, but her eyes were clear now, clear and locked on him. "I don't have much," she said, "not anymore. But if there's anything I can give you, already did." Ro interrupted gently. She frowned, unsure. He reached forward, brushing a smear of soot from her cheek. "You're the first thing I've loved in years." Cella froze. He dropped his hand, instantly regretting it. "I shouldn't have said that." But then she stepped forward. Her fingers touched his chest just over his heart. "Say it again." Ro looked at her. Really looked. At the bruises, the burn, the steadiness still in her bones. "You're the first thing I've loved in years," he said, quieter this time. She kissed him. Soft. Sure. Behind them, the children's laughter rose like a hymn through the clearing, and Ro knew without question he wasn't alone anymore. A new kind of quiet. After the children were safe in their mother's arms, and sleep finally claimed them, the cabin settled into a stillness that wasn't empty, but full. Full of breath of unsaid things, of a kind of calm that Ro Vance hadn't known since before the war. He sat on the edge of the bed while Cella slept restlessly. When she cried out in her dreams, broken murmurs of fire and loss, he didn't leave her to wrestle the memories alone. He held her hand until she quieted thumb, brushing along her knuckles like a prayer without words. When morning came, she was feverish again. He ladled broth, carefully spooning it to her lips. She barely spoke, but she didn't pull away when he wiped her brow or changed the bandage on her shoulder. Her silence wasn't distance anymore. It was exhaustion, the body finally letting go of fear now that it had somewhere to fall. Reed and Ruthie nestled together on a pile of quilts, barely stirred. They were pale, too thin. But they didn't cry. They sat with eyes too old for 8, watching Ro like they weren't sure if he was real. He didn't press them. He split wood outside, boots thudding against earth, with every swing the rhythm grounding. That evening, Cella's voice came back. Low, scratchy, but strong enough to answer when Ro asked again. Tell me about them, he said. The men. She stared into the fire for a long while before answering. They came after dark, she said slowly. 3 of them. Asked for water. I didn't trust their eyes, so I said no. They forced their way in. Knocked me down. One of them laughed as he set the barn ablaze. Ro's hands curled into fists, but he didn't interrupt. They grabbed the children, told me they'd fetch a price. I tried to fight, I did, but I wasn't strong enough. He didn't doubt her, not for a moment. Ro stood. You are strong now, he said, and you're safe. I'll see to it they never come there again. She caught his wrist. What if they come back? What if they hurt someone else? They won't, he said. Not on my land, not on yours either. Then he added quieter. You and your children are home now. A promise that Hunt's Ro rose before first light the next day, breath clouding in the chill as he cinched the saddle tight and loaded his rifle. Cella watched from the doorway, bundled in a shawl, worry etched deep in her face. She didn't try to stop him. She just looked at him like he carried the last good piece of the world on his shoulders. And maybe he did. He rode with a fury quiet and cold, not the kind that burned, but the kind that never forgot. The trail was hard, meandering through dry brush riverbeds over stone ridges meant to confuse. But Ro had lived enough winters tracking things more elusive than men. He knew how to read a snapped twig, a boot drag the rustle of birds disturbed by careless laughter. It took 2 days to find them. He rode long past dusk eyes narrowed beneath his hat, brim refusing to stop even as his horse foamed at the mouth. He didn't care. Not yet. By the time he reached the canyon, the men were drunk around a fire, laughing, loud, unguarded. He spotted the wagon first, then the children bound at the wrist sitting in the dirt like thrown luggage. He felt something coil deep in his gut, a rage too still to scream. The shot dropped the first man before he could draw breath. The second stood cursed and went for his belt. Ro moved like wind knife slicing low across the ribs. The man fell hard. The third fled into the dark. Ro didn't follow. He ran to the children instead. Their eyes were wide, tearless, stunned. Reed. Ruthie. I'm Ro, he said, crouching beside them. Your mama sent me. Ruthie blinked, then collapsed into tears. Reed grabbed him around the neck like a lifeline. They rode through the night with stars overhead and silence behind them. No one spoke, but they didn't need to. The moment that changed. Everything. The cabin glowed soft with lamplight as Ro approached in the hush before dawn. The clearing was quiet, pine needles glittering with dew and the sky painted pale gold beyond the tree line. Ro's arms ached, his horse limped, and the children had fallen asleep against his coat. But still he pressed forward. Cella stood on the porch. She didn't move at first, just stared. And then Ruthie. Her voice cracked on the name. The girl woke, blinked once, then scrambled down from the saddle. Mama Reed followed close behind. They collided in the grass, a mess of limbs. Sobs, laughter. Cella dropped to her knees and clutched them both like she would never let go. Ro stood a few feet away, breathless. He didn't interrupt. He couldn't, but then Cella looked up. Her face streaked with tears and ash and wonder. You brought them back, she said. Ro nodded. I gave you my word. She rose slowly and stepped toward him. The nightgown she wore fluttered in the morning breeze, and her hands trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from something stirring back to life. I don't have much, she said softly. Not anymore. You already gave me something, he replied. More than you know. What did I give you? Ro hesitated, then reached up and brushed the last smear of ash from her cheek. "You're the first thing I've loved in years." She stared at him. He looked down. "I shouldn't have said that." But she stepped forward, placing her hand against his chest. "Say it again." He looked into her through her and said it again, quieter. "You're the first thing I've loved in years." And then she kissed him. Behind them, Reed and Ruthie laughed, running wild through the grass. And Ro, for the first time in what felt like forever, knew what it meant to belong. The first morning of a new life. Morning came slow and golden, spilling through the pine trees and warming the clearing like a gentle hand. For the first time in years, Ro didn't rise with the weight of silence. He stirred to the soft murmur of children's laughter. Reed was collecting pine cones near the tree line, placing them carefully in a row. Ruthie followed behind him, gathering dry sticks with the solemn dedication of someone older than her years. Inside, Cella moved quietly, but not cautiously. She swept out the corners of the cabin with a careful rhythm, her skirt swishing just above the floorboards. Not from weakness anymore, but from that peculiar weariness that comes from learning how to take up space again. She didn't ask if she could. She just did it, and Ro let her. He sat on the porch, boots planted firm in the dirt, hands wrapped around a mug of strong coffee gone cold. He watched her through the doorway without saying a word. There was something sacred in her movements, quiet, deliberate, steady. The fire she'd built that morning still burned. She hadn't let it go out after sunrise like most would. It stayed lit, crackling low, casting warmth into every corner of the cabin. A fire that said, "We intend to stay." Ro went for a ride later that day, not far, just down to the bend where choke cherries grew wild and stubborn. He brought back a few in a scrap of cloth. Bitter things, but Cella smiled when she saw them. Not because of the taste, but because he thought to bring something home. The next day, he returned with a strip of calico blue and a comb with most of its teeth still good. Small things, but they mattered. At night, they sat by the fire after the children had gone to sleep. They didn't speak much, but the silence wasn't heavy anymore. It had softened, like the air between two people who no longer needed to be alone, learning the shape of belonging. It happened during a quiet moment, with the sun just slipping past the treetops and shadows lengthening across the porch. Cella stood in the doorway, wiping her hands on a linen cloth. Her hair was loose from its braid curling at the nape of her neck. She watched the way the light fell on the cabin, her gaze trailing along the beams Ro had cut and raised with his own hands. "You built this place yourself," she said. Ro looked up from the trough where he was cleaning out moss. "I did." "How long ago? 7 years now." She nodded. Her fingers brushed the edge of the doorframe. "It's sturdy." Ro stepped closer. "It was meant to last." She looked at him, then not like someone making conversation, but like someone trying to decide what it meant to believe in something again. "I don't know how to be part of something that lasts," she whispered. Ro didn't hesitate. "You already are." She didn't argue. That evening, Reed carved a whistle from a willow branch, and Ruthie spent nearly an hour braiding a long chain of grass. When she finished, she tied it to the fence post like it was holy. Cella sat on the porch, mending a shirt of Ro's he hadn't asked her to fix. He noticed the careful stitches the thread pulled smooth. "You don't have to do that," he said gently. "I know," she replied, eyes still on her work, "but I want to." He watched her hands. They didn't tremble anymore. A question with weight. That night, after the sun dipped low and the pines whispered secrets to the stars, Ro sat in the dirt near her feet while she sewed. The cabin behind them glowed soft. Reed and Ruthie were already curled under the quilt cheeks, pink with sleep and cold. Cella looked up from her sewing. "What did you grow at your place?" Ro leaned back on his hands. "Corn, a few hens, 2 cows. Soil wasn't much good, but I tried. I kept a garden," she said. "Not much took, but I made it work. You'll have better luck here. Ground softer." She looked at him. "You saying we'll stay, I'm saying I hope you want to." She stared into him like she was measuring the truth of what he'd said. "I need to know something first," she said. "Go on. Were you always alone out here?" Ro nodded once. "By choice at first. Then it just stuck." She was quiet. Then and now Ro reached for her hand, rough palm closing gently around hers. "Now I want something different." She didn't pull away. The next morning she asked him to teach her how to shoot. Said it plain like she was asking for salt. He didn't blink, just handed her the rifle. She missed the first few shots, then squared her shoulders, found her breath, and hit the tin target dead center. She lowered the gun, pushed her hair back. "I won't be helpless again." Ro studied her pride rising. "You never were," beneath the firelight of honesty. That night, Cella sat close to the flames, her children wrapped in quilts nearby. The fire crackled softly, shadows dancing on the cabin walls. Ro sat across from her, whittling the edge of a wooden peg. His movements slow, unhurried. He didn't ask questions, but his presence invited truth, not with pressure, but with stillness. Cella spoke first, her voice a low murmur over the wood smoke. "You don't ask questions." Ro met her eyes. "I'll wait for what you want to tell me." She nodded, swallowing. "I was 16 when I married," she said. "He was twice my age. Thought kindness was weakness. I learned to keep my voice small, to move quiet. He never hit me where others could see." Ro's hands stopped carving, but he didn't speak. "He died 3 winters ago. Fever took him in 3 days. I didn't cry." The firelight flickered, and Cella's gaze shifted to her sleeping children. "I brought them west last spring. Thought maybe if we had land of our own, grew what we needed, we'd be safe. I thought if I kept the door barred and the fire low, no harm would come." Ro's voice was soft. "You weren't wrong. You just weren't given time." She turned her eyes toward him. "And you, why live out here alone?" He hesitated, then nodded. "There was someone once, before the war. I came back different." She didn't wait. "I don't blame her. I gave her no reason to." Cella's expression softened. She reached out, touched the edge of his sleeve. "You're not that man anymore." Ro met her gaze. "No, I'm not." Outside, the wind moved like a hush through the trees. Inside, something between them held, a quiet that holds weight. Later, long after the children had gone to sleep and the fire burned low, Ro sat beside Cella near the hearth. She looked toward the corner where Reed and Ruthie lay curled together, then back to him. "They already call this home," she said. Ro's eyes were steady. "And you?" She didn't answer with words. She leaned forward until her forehead touched his. Their breath mingled. Her hand found his fingers curling slowly. They stayed like that, unmoving for a long time. There was no urgency. No reaching for what had been lost. Just a quiet, shared promise of what could be. The night deepened, but the cabin stayed warm. Not just from the fire, but from the care layered into every silence, every glance. Later, as she rested her head against his shoulder, Ro wrapped his arm around her back. His hold wasn't possessive. It was steady, protective, like someone building a wall around something he never wanted the world to touch again. No words were spoken. None were needed. And when the first frost came in the days ahead, they faced it together. Frost on the ground roots beneath. The frost settled quietly, creeping across the garden rows like a thin veil of silver. Cella knelt in the dirt with her skirt tucked beneath her knees, fingers working through the cold soil. She pulled the last of the season's harvest, small carrots, thin onions, barely enough to fill the basket. But her hands moved with a kind of peace, not because there was plenty, but because there was purpose. Near the fence, Ro replaced a splintered rail. His shirt sleeves rolled, the hammer swinging steady and true. He looked up every so often, his eyes always finding her. She didn't notice at first, or maybe she did, and just didn't say anything. Down by the creek, the children's voices rose like birdsong. They were chasing trout with a tin pail, their laughter threading into the wind. The sound didn't feel out of place anymore. Cella stood slowly, wiping her palms on her apron. She crossed the clearing with the basket in hand, then stopped beside Ro. "You ever think about leaving these mountains?" Ro leaned on the hammer eyes, squinting into the trees. "I used to. Thought maybe I'd head south where the snow doesn't bite so soon, but it never felt like the right kind of empty." She nodded. "My brother wrote me once. Said there was land in Kansas. Easier to grow things." He looked at her, searching. "You want to go?" She turned toward the tree line. "Not anymore." They stood in silence, the scent of pine and cold soil rising between them. Her hair had come loose again, curling soft against her neck. "I'd like to build on," she said. "Give the children a room of their own." Ro's brow creased. "You mean to stay permanent?" She didn't flinch. "I mean to make a life." Ro nodded slowly. "I'll start cutting timber tomorrow." Cella reached for his hand. "I want to help." He squeezed her fingers gently. "You will." That night she sat near the fire, watching Ro whittle pegs for framing. Outside, the coyotes howled in the distance, but they felt far away now, like they belonged to another world. Naming what grows. By the time the new morning rolled in, the scent of sawdust drifted through the clearing. The roof beams of the new addition rose beneath a sky pale with mist. Ro worked in rhythm, each nail and notch placed with the kind of care reserved for things he meant to last. His sleeves were rolled to the elbow, arms streaked with wood dust. He didn't speak much, he never had, but every movement said he was building something more than a room. He was building space for them. For all of them. Cella stood below with a bucket of nails, handing him what he needed with a quiet attentiveness. Their hands brushed more than once, and neither of them pulled back. The silence between them had changed again. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't longing. It was a quiet that spoke of shared labor, of mutual effort, of a knowing that didn't need many words. By midday, the ridge beam was finally in place. Ro climbed down, slow, wincing slightly as he stretched his right shoulder. "Your shoulder again?" Cella asked. He nodded once. "Old break. Cold stiffens it." She didn't offer pity, only stepped in front of him, eyes sharp. "You're a proud man, Ro Vance, but I won't let you limp yourself into the ground." Ro let out a breath and half smiled. "I'll sit a spell." So they did on the back step, boots just barely touching. Cella pulled her shawl tighter, the autumn breeze winding through the aspens like breath through a reed flute. I used to think stillness meant nothing was happening, she said. Ro rubbed a hand along his thigh, nodding. Some things need quiet to grow at all. She smiled at that, picking up a thin twig and running it through her fingers. Ruthie asked if we'd plant apple trees come spring, she said. You should. She wants to name them. Ro looked at her sideways, a hint of a grin. What would you name a tree? Cella tilted her head, thoughtful. Something that makes it feel rooted. Something you'd want to come back to. Ro leaned forward, elbows on knees. I'd name one after you. Cella laughed, not loud but sudden and full. You'd have a crooked tree with a temper. No, Ro said, smiling now. I'd have the strongest one in the orchard. The stew that meant more. That evening, Cella stood at the stove, stirring a pot of stew that filled the cabin with the smell of thyme and slow-boiled meat. Ruthie sat cross-legged on the floor, holding a handful of bent nails Ro had set aside, carefully straightening each one with a small river stone. Reed had drawn a two-room house in the ashes of the hearth, tracing every window and door like it was already theirs. Ro sat at the table, working the stiffness from his shoulder with slow, deliberate movements. Cella turned ladled stew into a tin bowl and set it in front of him. I've been thinking about schooling, she said. Ro looked up. You want to send them into town? She shook her head. I want to teach them myself. He watched her a moment. You know how I do. She sat across from him. My mother taught me with a slate and a coal stub. I remember every lesson. Ro took a bite, chewing slow. You ever think of teaching other children? There aren't any near. There might be. Come spring, folks will move through again. Homesteads grow like weeds after a wet winter. Cella folded her hands in her lap. I'd need books, paper. We'll get them. She looked up, gaze steady. Why do you keep saying, we Ro? He didn't flinch. Because I mean it. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was full of potential of invitation. That night, as the children slept in their own new corner room, Cella stood by the window, arms crossed. Outside, the moon hung like a shard of bone. The trees moved like they breathed. Ro approached, not touching, just standing beside her. When I saw the fire, she said, I thought it was the end of everything. He stayed silent. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. They don't now. She turned toward him. You said I was the first thing you'd loved in years. Do you still feel that? Ro met her eyes. Every breath. She stepped closer. I don't want to be something you save. I want to stand beside you. You already do. A choice made in stillness. Cella reached up and touched the side of his face. Her fingers brushed the stubble along his jaw, rough but warm. Then let's stop waiting, she whispered. Ro didn't move, didn't blink. He only placed his hand over hers and pressed it to his chest. You sure I've never been more? They stood in the silence of that room, wrapped in warmth, wrapped in the knowing that they weren't reaching for something fleeting, but for something they had already begun. They didn't speak after that. Not with words. The fire burned low. The wind stirred outside but couldn't touch what was held between them. And when dawn came, it brought the first snow-soft quiet, covering the clearing in a hush that didn't frighten this time. It wrapped the cabin like a blessing. Inside, Ruthie bent over a slate, copying letters with her tongue between her teeth. Reed carved a toy horse from a scrap of pine. Ro entered from the shed, snow clinging to his shoulders. He dropped a bundle of firewood beside the stove. You'll freeze, Cella said, brushing snow from his collar. I've known colder, he replied. but I wouldn't mind a second pair of hands in the shed. That beam over the door's starting to sag. I'll come, she said. After the lesson. Ruthie looked up wide-eyed. Can we have snowshoes? Mama, like Mr. Vance, made Cella glanced at Ro. If we cut the birch right, he said, they'll hold. Ruthie clapped. Reed grinned. Outside the world was white. Inside it was warm in ways wood couldn't account for. Working side by side. By afternoon, the sky cleared into pale blue, the kind of winter sun that warmed the air without melting the snow. Ro and Cella worked in the shed side by side beneath the scent of cedar and cold earth. He held the sagging beam steady while she drove in the wedge he'd shaped. Her hands were firm, no longer uncertain. They didn't tremble. Her sleeves were rolled to the elbow braid tucked over one shoulder, and her eyes narrowed in focus as she tapped the mallet into the joint. Ro leaned back, watching her with quiet pride. That'll hold through winter. Cella wiped her brow with the back of her sleeve and looked at the frame. Then, without facing him, she asked softly, "You think we'll still be here next snow?" His brow furrowed, not out of doubt, but out of the weight of her question. "Why wouldn't we?" he asked. She hesitated. "I've never stayed anywhere this long." Ro considered that. "Then it's about time." She studied him, searching for anything in his face that might shift. "I never thought I'd want permanence again," she admitted. He stepped a little closer, voice low. "Do you?" "I do." That night after dinner, after the fire was stoked and the children drifted to sleep beneath their quilt, Ro brought down a cedar box from the top shelf. It was small, carved with care, the grain worn smooth by time and memory. He opened it at the table and pulled out a square of folded linen. Inside, resting in the center, was a simple gold ring, dull with age, whole. "It was my mother's," he said. "She wore it through every hard year. Said it reminded her of what stayed even when nothing else did." Cella's hands stilled in her lap. "I never thought I'd pass it on." Ro continued, voice gravel, low. "But I want you to have it." She looked up slowly. Her voice was barely a breath. "You mean to marry me?" Ro didn't blink. "I mean to walk beside you, from now until I'm bone, if you'll have me." She rose slow, not hesitant, but reverent. She took the ring and slid it onto her finger, then leaned in until her forehead met his. "I'll be yours," she whispered, "and you'll be mine." No more needed saying, not with words. A life that feels like breathing. The morning came soft and cold, but inside the cabin it smelled of warmth, cornmeal biscuits, pine sap and firewood still crackling in the stove. When Ruthie and Reed woke, they found their mother's hand in Ro's, both of them seated close by the hearth. Their fire glowed steady. Their silence held no fear. By spring, the addition was finished. 2 small rooms with glass windows that caught the morning light like gold. Ro built a new coop out back, hammering it together from scrap and cedar. A peddler passed through the canyon and traded 4 hens for an old coat and a carved whistle Reed had made. Cella's lessons grew longer. She taught Ruthie to read by the stove, her voice soft but sure, while Reed practiced his numbers in chalk along the side of the cabin. They learned slowly, steadily, like roots taking hold. They married in June. No priest, no preacher. Just them beneath the ridge where the lupine bloomed wild and fierce. Cella wore a dress she had stitched wildflowers into. Ro wore his best shirt. Ruthie carried a basket of yarrow. Reed stood at Ro's side, solemn and proud. They didn't speak vows. They didn't need to. Their vows had already been spoken in labor, in touch and firelight and survival. That summer, the garden gave more than it ever had. Beans hung thick on the vine, and squash lay heavy in the dirt. Cella hummed as she worked. Ro carved her a stool, for the porch sanded smooth to just the right height for her to rest her feet when the sun dipped low. The roots that hold. By autumn, the children had outgrown their shoes. Ro made new ones from elk hide, stitching them by firelight with a patience few men carried anymore. Cella began teaching 2 neighbor girls whose family had settled near the river bend. Word of her lesson spread slow but sure, like everything in these hills. The cabin grew fuller, not with clutter, not with noise, but with life, with breathing and laughter, and the quiet joy of a home built from the ashes of ruin. One evening the sky turned gold across the field. Cella sat beside Ro on the porch, her hands resting over her middle. "You're quiet," he said, glancing at her. She turned toward him, eyes soft with a knowledge deeper than speech. "There'll be another come spring," she said. Ro's hand found hers steady and warm. "Then we'll add another room." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder. "I didn't know it could feel like this." Ro looked out at the land, at the fence line they mended, the trees that whispered through the seasons. "You earned it." They sat there as dusk deepened, watching the mountains darken beneath the sky. The wind stirred the grass. The chickens rustled in the coop. Inside, the children played a game with pebbles on the floor. Ro pressed a kiss to Cella's temple. "Home," he said. She smiled. "Yes." And they stayed, through winters and harvests, through new cries in the night, through boots left at the door and fires kept lit through storms. They stayed, they loved, and they built something that did not break. The rhythm of staying. The first snow of that new year fell in the quiet hours before dawn, soft like breath settling gently across the clearing and cloaking the earth in white. Cella stepped outside just as light began to push through the treetops. Her breath rose in silver threads, the air sharp against her cheeks. Behind her, the cabin glowed golden, its warmth spilling across the snow like a promise. She didn't look for danger, not anymore. She listened to the stillness, not the kind that follows ruin, but the kind that follows healing, a kind she hadn't known she could trust again. Inside, Ruthie bent over, her slate tongue peeking from the corner of her mouth as she copied the letters Cella had etched. Each one slow, careful, real. Reed sat near the stove, carving a toy horse from pine. The curls of wood that gathered at his feet looked like fallen petals. His fingers, once too thin and unsure, now moved with calm confidence. The door opened, and Ro entered, arms full of firewood, scarf dusted with snow. He knelt beside the stove, stacking logs. "You'll freeze, Cella," said, smiling as she brushed snow from his collar. "I've known colder," he replied. "But I wouldn't mind a second pair of hands in the shed." That beam's sagging again. "I'll come," she said. After the lesson, Ruthie looked up. "Mama, can we have snowshoes like Mr. Vance made?" Cella turned to Ro with a knowing glance. "If we cut the birch right, he said they'll hold. We'll make a pair for each of you." Ruthie clapped. Reed grinned. By afternoon, the sky cleared. Cella and Ro worked together beneath its pale blue stretch, hand in hand, with the ordinary magic of building a life. Inside the stew simmered, the children played, and the rhythm of staying continued quiet, certain whole. Time rooted in timber and thread. They built the next season as if spring had already come. The shed was repaired, The fence was reinforced, and by the time the apple saplings arrived in burlap sacks, the soil had thawed enough for planting. Ruthie insisted on naming each one. She gave them names like Mirth Still Hope and one simply called Mama's Tree. Cella laughed but didn't argue. Ro built a new coop from the leftover planks and patched leather, securing it tight against weasels and wind. 4 more hens arrived by trade, and soon the morning air was filled with clucks and the occasional egg laid in quiet triumph. The days lengthened, and so did Cella's lessons. Ruthie was now reading aloud by firelight, while Reed practiced arithmetic against the cabin wall, chalk in hand, tongue tucked between his teeth. The neighbors brought their own children to learn from Cella, and slowly the cabin became more than a home. It became a center of language, of learning, of kindness in a rough land. One evening, as the sun turned the field, Gold Cella sat on the porch beside Ro. Her hands rested over her stomach, the gentle curve beneath her apron unmistakable. "You're quiet," Ro said. "There'll be another come spring," she whispered. Ro took her hand in his thumb, brushing gently over her knuckles. "Then we'll add another room." She leaned against him, the sky deepening above them. "I never thought I'd want this," she said. "You deserve it," Ro replied. And with that, they sat together as dusk folded the world around them, safe in a life not dreamed but built, a foundation that does not break. They stayed, through frost and thaw, through harvest and hunger, through the kind of days that arrived with no announcement but shaped everything anyway. They stayed. The cabin became a place of rhythm and resilience. Boots were left at the door. Bread rose slow on the hearth. Baby cries filled the night, then softened into coos, then giggles. Reed learned to whittle better than Ro, and Ruthie began to keep a journal, copying words she said tasted good on her tongue, plenty kind quiet. Cella taught without hesitation now. Slate turned to paper, coal to pencil. And one morning a wagon pulled up bearing books paid for in preserves and stitched shirts and Ro's hand-cut lumber. A miracle by post and trade. Ro never stopped building, not just shelves and benches and sheds, but days, evenings, safety. He learned how to braid Ruthie's hair and how to patch Reed's knees when he fell. He came home dusty always, but never alone. They grew, and in growing, they held. One night, years later, Cella found Ro sitting at the edge of the porch, their youngest child asleep on his lap, the stars reflecting in his eyes. "I was thinking," he said, "how you once told me you didn't know how to be part of something lasting." She sat beside him, pulled the blanket higher over the child's small shoulders, and he turned to her. "I think lasting things are built one quiet day at a time." She took his hand. "What if I forget how again I'll remind you?" They sat in silence for a long time, the kind of silence that doesn't separate, but binds. And so they stayed. When people asked, years later, how the homestead came to be what it was, how the schoolhouse began, how the orchard grew so thick it fed half the county, they pointed to Ro Vance and Cella Monroe. But no one really knew the story behind it. Not all of it. Only the children did, those who had once been tied to a wagon wheel in a canyon and rescued by a man with fire in his chest. Only the woman did who once crawled through ash and now walked barefoot through blooming rows of squash and beans. Only the man did who once built a cabin for solitude and now carved chairs for a family that needed more room every spring. And maybe that was enough. In the end, they didn't need to be remembered in books. They were remembered in soil, in laughter, in fences that held in fires that stayed lit, in children's names etched into trees. They didn't leave. They didn't run. They stayed. And what they built didn't break.